talk about the digestive system. And the digestive system includes two major groups of organs. We have an alimentary canal as well as what we call accessory digestive organs. So if you think about the digestive system in terms of what it really is, we know it's a tract because you can also call it the gastrointestinal tract, right? But effectively it's a tube, in fact a muscular tube, from mouth to anus, right? So it starts at your mouth and it's a muscular tube that traverses through your thoracic cage, through your abdominal cavity, and then it exits via the anus, right? Now that's the GI tract, aka alimentary canal. Now, associated with that though, we have what are called accessory digestive organs. And these accessory digestive organs would be like your teeth, your tongue, your liver and gallbladder, and any kind of other digestive glands that are associated with that, like your pancreas, right? So they're not technically part of the tube, but they happen to be nearby, and they aid with the process of digestion, right? So if we look at the digestive system just sort of as a whole here, you can see it's that muscular tube from mouth to anus, and if you follow it down, it starts with the oral cavity, and it goes back towards the pharynx. Now, at the level of the oral cavity, you got salivary glands, and the purpose of salivary glands is to help kind of moisten, bind food, and digest food, because there's enzymes in saliva. The pharynx, which is the back of the throat here, is involved with swallowing, so it's going to squeeze that food down towards the esophagus, and then the esophagus is a long muscular tube that goes down your neck, behind your heart, and then down below the respiratory diaphragm, and then it eventually drains into the stomach. And you can see the stomach here. Now the stomach's not involved with absorption. It's mostly a storage chamber of food, as well as involved with digestion. In fact, there's a lot of acid that's produced in the stomach, and so the pH of stomach acid is pretty close to 1. So it's super, super acidic. So think of this as just like a big old acid chamber, right? So it just digests that food there. Now what happens next, you guys, is that the stomach can contract and force that food into the duodenum. Except we wouldn't call it food anymore. We call it chyme. So C-H-Y-M-E, chyme. And chyme is the acidic mixture of ingested material and stomach juices. And so this first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. What makes the small intestine small is not its length. In fact, the small intestine is like about 25 feet long or so. So what makes the small intestine small is actually its diameter. So it's more thin as a tube. And the first part is the duodenum. Now this is significant because this is where a lot of digestive juices are drained, like bile and pancreatic juices. And they're drained in the duodenum where they mix with chyme, and that's where further digestion begins, or occurs rather. Now the next part of the small intestine is called the jejunum, and that's going to be the next third or so. Now the jejunum is where digestion continues. However, there's a lot of absorption that's occurring here as well. In fact, the small intestine we think about as being like the major absorptive organ of our digestive tracts. So this is where most absorption occurs. And so if you kind of traverse along this weird kind of system of tubes here, eventually you get over to the large intestine. And the distal end of the small intestine is what we call the ileum. So the ileum is what meets up with the beginning of the large intestine, and this part's called the cecum. So the cecum is the beginning of your large intestine, and that's what has the vermiform appendix attached, right? So we call it the vermiform appendix because vermiform means worm-like, like Zawurm, right? You say if you think of like a German person, you're saying worm, you go Zawurm, right? Like the early bird catches the worm. So the vermiform appendix here on the cecum. And then we have the ascending colon, and then over here we have the transverse colon, and then it goes to the descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, and anus. Now the colon is the large intestine. Now what makes the large intestine large is not its length. In fact, it's actually pretty significantly shorter than the small intestine. The reason why the large intestine is called large is that its diameter is much larger than the small intestine, right? So it's just a bigger, and it's just a wider tube, rather. Now, in the colon or large intestine, you find a tremendous amount of bacteria. In fact, there ends up being more bacterial cells in your colon than cells of your whole body, right? Like there's more bacteria in your guts than your own human cells of your body. And the way that works is bacterial cells are small. Now, we want those bacteria there because they actually provide some protection against other potentially disease-causing or pathogenic microbes. And those bacteria can also help make vitamins for our body. So when you think about vitamin K, which is involved with blood clotting, that comes from gut bacteria. Or B vitamins that are involved with metabolism, that also comes from gut bacteria. And so the colon stores those gut bacteria, and they kind of live off of our waste that we didn't absorb. And the colon, though, or large intestine, is really not much of an absorptive organ. It's mostly a place to dehydrate feces and store feces until they're released. Okay. Now we'll go into the detail of all of these regions of the digestive tract as we move on in this chapter, but this kind of gives us a nice little overview. Okay. So if we look at the digestive tract in terms of its function, it looks a lot different here, right? So we want to define some terms. The first term we want to define is ingestion, right? Like to ingest food means to take in food by mouth, right? And so like if you have like Captain Crunch for breakfast or like a banana for breakfast or something, you would have ingested that in your mouth. And then the next step would be to what? Start breaking it down by chewing or mastication. So mastication is the process of mechanical digestion of food, right? So when you chew or masticate, you're basically chewing up that food and mechanically digesting it into smaller pieces, okay? So you have mechanical breakdown, which involves both your teeth, your tongue, and your hard palate. So if you guys ever start chewing some food and you start thinking about what your mouth's doing while you're chewing it, you're going to feel your tongue actually forces that food up against the roof of your mouth or your hard palate, because that serves as a nice working surface. It's kind of hard, and you can push things against it. They kind of squish back down, and you can keep chewing it. So you just sort of rotate up and down as you chew, which is kind of cool. And your tongue plays a big role with mechanical breakdown as well. Now, swallowing is what we call propulsion. So propulsion is a muscular sort of contraction that moves these digestive contents along the tube. Because if you think about it, and you look at the length of this tube, it's not straight, right? So you couldn't rely on gravity. It's not like you can just swallow food and hope because of gravity that it's going to get all the way down to your anus, right? In fact, it forms like a pretty complex network of twists and turns. So what we need then is some help. Like you can't just jump up and down and hope that your digestive contents get down towards your anus. You know what I mean? So what you need is help, and that would be propulsion, which is essentially muscular contractions, and there are waves of muscle contractions that help move those digestive materials along to the next part, right? So when you swallow, that's propulsion, and then beyond that, when we have the esophagus, those materials are also propelled towards the stomach through muscular waves of contraction. And then in the stomach, we also get some churning. In that churning motion of the stomach, which you guys have all heard before, it's like that noise, right? That churning is essentially also mechanical digestion, because you're basically mixing that food around, folding in some digestive juices, but you're also kind of breaking it apart into smaller pieces as you mix it around, right? And so the stomach does play a role in mechanical breakdown. Now, when you think about digestion, it can be either mechanical or chemical, right? So we already talked about how mechanical digestion occurs in the mouth and the stomach, but what about chemical digestion? Well, chemical digestion would involve either acid, molecules that maybe help break apart other molecules, or enzymes that carry out chemical reactions, right? So what happens, you guys, is that enzymatic chemical digestion actually begins in the mouth with salivary enzymes. And it continues in the stomach with stomach acid, right? That's more chemical breakdown. But the stomach also does release some digestive enzymes as well, like lipases and other proteases, and those can actually help to break down nutrients further. Now, a lot of chemical digestion occurs in the duodenum. And can you guys think about why that might be? Like, why might a lot of chemical digestion occur in the duodenum? What drained there? Do y'all remember? Like, what kind of juices were drained into the duodenum? What's that? Yeah, bile juices and pancreatic juices were both drained in the duodenum, right? And so that makes sense how that additional chemical digestion is going to occur there in the duodenum. And then you have propulsion all along the length. However, if you guys remember, the small intestine was the major absorptive organ, right? So if you guys look here with these kind of like orangish, reddish arrows, what we're seeing here is the process of absorption. And absorption is where you're taking a substance from the lumen or space of your digestive tract and then bringing that into the body. And there's two places it can go. You either can absorb nutrients into your bloodstream, or you can absorb nutrients into lymph. And if you guys remember going back to ANP1, we talked about how the lymphatic system is a branch of your circulatory system, but it's involved with immune defense and picking up excess fluid from your tissues. There's a third function here, and that's actually the absorption of fats. So when you absorb fats along your digestive tract, they're not absorbed straight into blood. They're actually absorbed straight into your lymphatic system. And when that happens, it forms a mixture of fatty lymph, which we call chyle, which is C-H-Y-L-E, chyle, right? Fatty lymph. And then that actually gets drained up by your heart. So over here we see this blood vessel, right? And the rest of those nutrients are absorbed into the bloodstream. So if it's something that's not a fat or a lipid, right, that's going to be absorbed into blood. So when you think about like your carbohydrates, your proteins, your nucleic acids, minerals, and water, like those get absorbed right into your bloodstream. However, for the blood that's going to your digestive organs and absorbing nutrients, it doesn't just go out to the rest of your body right away. In fact, all of the blood vessels of your digestive organs converge into one big vein, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, and that goes straight into the liver for processing. So your liver processes those absorbed nutrients first, right? And then down here we have the colon or large intestine. So do we get a lot of absorption in the colon or large intestine? Not really, no. We do absorb some water, we do absorb some vitamins, but for the most part it's like a dehydration place and a place to store feces until it's appropriate to release them, right? So, and then we have defecation. And actually, eventually we will talk about the process of defecation and what's involved there. And it involves muscles in your nervous system. And so it's important to talk about because if you had muscular disease or nervous system dysfunction, you can lead to problems with defecation like incontinence, right? So, all right, guys. Now, what this slide is showing are the two types of propulsion. We have what's called peristalsis as well as segmentation. So peristalsis is where we have these muscular waves of contraction that essentially force a digestive content in a particular direction. So let's imagine this is your esophagus, and just based on the color, maybe you had some like cocoa pebbles for breakfast, right? So, or Cocoa Puffs, right? That's what it was, cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. So you had some Cocoa Puffs for breakfast, and you chewed it up and you swallowed it, and then eventually got into your esophagus. Well, how does it get from the top of your neck all the way down to your stomach? Well, you have peristalsis. So peristalsis are these involuntary waves of muscle contraction. They're mediated by the smooth muscle that's in the wall of your esophagus. And then what happens is that those digestive contents are propelled in a forward direction, one way, where they need to go. Okay. Now you can get reverse peristalsis, and that would happen with conditions like vomiting, right? Like what if you needed to get contents from your stomach up and then back out of your mouth, like in the case of vomiting? Well, peristalsis can go the other way under certain conditions, but for the most part, it goes in a forward direction, which would be mouth towards anus. Okay. Now that's only half the story though, because if we only had peristalsis, that means that only the outside of this little lump of food would be digested. So what we need then is another process to mix that food around as it's propelled. And we call that segmentation. So segmentation is a process of mixing where you basically have muscular contractions that move back and forth. And so what you start to do is you start to mix that food around. And by doing so, you're folding in digestive enzymes. You're helping to break apart that food into smaller, more digestible pieces. And all of this sort of aids in the process of digestion. So that's segmentation. So what we see here on this slide, you guys, is essentially how our digestive tract knows when to do these things, right? So like, for instance, do you guys think that you always have peristalsis going on really strongly throughout the day? No. Like it's only going to happen when it's necessary, right? And that would be when there's the presence of food or if you're thinking about food, right? And so what we have then are different types of receptors that can receive information about whether food is there or not, right? And they can use that to coordinate digestion. So what we have are chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors. If y'all remember going back to ANP1, we talked about how chemoreceptors are sensitive to chemicals. Mechanoreceptors are sensitive to mechanical stretch, right? So let me give you an example. Your stomach sort of knows, not consciously, but it knows through reflexes when food has entered the stomach, because in the walls of the stomach you have chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors. So when you swallow some food and it plops down into your stomach, chemoreceptors can pick up the chemical content of that food, and your stomach can actually start to rely on reflexes that can help it digest what's present, right? Whether it's lipids or carbohydrates. And then it can also rely on mechanoreceptors for stretch, right? Like the stomach can but it can sort of receive when it's stretched. That way it can also coordinate digestion, right? And so these receptors play a pretty important role. Now, one of the big things in the stomach, you guys, is a change in pH. So what's the pH of our stomach acid? Do you guys remember? Yeah, right around 1, right? So super, super acidic. What about the pH of the food you eat? Do you think it's that acidic? No way, right? So what if you swallow a bunch of food and it plops down into your stomach? What's going to happen to the pH of your stomach? If it had been 1, what should happen to a pH when you swallow food? Yeah, probably a little bit higher pH, like a higher number. It's going to become less acidic, good, or more basic, because the food we eat is typically not as acidic as stomach acid. And so that's what the stomach relies on as a sort of an indicator of whether or not food's present, is we have chemoreceptors for pH. And so if your pH rises or becomes more basic in the stomach, that tells the stomach, oh, hey, there's food here. And so then it starts coordinating digestion based on that information, which is pretty cool. So it actually initiates reflexes. Now, what's kind of fascinating about these reflexes, you guys, is that they can either involve your brain and spinal cord, and when they do, that would be called long reflexes, or those reflexes can occur just in the organ itself. They might not even have to go to your brain and spinal cord. Some of these reflexes can be just in your organ. So when we talk about the reflexes that coordinate digestion, oh, by the way, we should probably define what a reflex is, right? So if you'll remember, going back to A&P1, we said that reflexes were an automatic, stereotyped response to a stimulus. So it's automatic because you don't have to think about it. It's stereotyped because it occurs the same way every time, but it only happens if there's a stimulus. So for instance, a reflex in your stomach could be something like, if the pH rises, then it starts to secrete more acid. And that's a really neat example of a reflex there, right? Now we have short versus long reflexes. Short reflexes involve what's called your enteric nervous system. And the enteric nervous system is found within the walls of your gut organs, right? That's what the enteric nervous system is. And you guys may have heard of this. It's called the gut brain. And there's about 100 million neurons in this gut brain. Now, there's not like a single location where there's the gut brain. Instead, it's actually distributed throughout the wall of that tube. And so that's this enteric nerve plexus. And it can help to respond to those stimuli and mediate those reflexes that coordinate digestion, right? Now, the long reflexes involve your brain and spinal cord. And they're longer because it takes longer, obviously, for information to get to your brain and spinal cord and then back again to the digestive organ. Now, with these long reflexes, these are going to be associated with your parasympathetic nervous system, right? So you guys remember this one going back to A&P? What was our kind of catchphrase for the parasympathetic nervous system? Nice, good. Rest and digest, right? And so if you guys remember, parasympathetic nerves were cranial nerves for the most part, except for the sacral spinal nerves. And the major parasympathetic nerve for your internal organs, if y'all remember, was the vagus nerve. So it goes down your neck, down into your thoracic and digestive viscera, and then it helps to mediate digestion that way, right? So that would be involved with these long reflexes because it comes from your brain. All right, so what we see here, you guys, are this idea that external stimuli can potentially excite your nervous system to begin the process of digestion. So this idea that external stimuli could do this would be like the sight, the smell, the taste, or even the thought of food, right? What happens then is you become conscious of this, and that in itself can make you hungry, right? That's if you're already kind of hungry. And we call this the cephalic phase because it involves your brain. Now, what happens next is that if you are hungry and the sight, the thought, the smell, or the taste of food is like, getting your brain excited about food, then what happens is your brain can send information along the vagus nerve down towards your digestive organs and then communicate with the enteric nerves in that organ to basically help carry out what we call feed forward, which would be the preparation for food before the food actually gets there. So what's kind of cool, you guys, is just thinking about food makes your stomach start to create more stomach acid. Now, even just smelling food helps your stomach start to churn and kind of move those juices around and get ready for that impending food, potentially, right? It's sort of preparing for the potential of food. You might not actually eat it if you smell it, but if you do, then your digestive tract is ready, right? So we call those effectors. They're the ones that kind of carry out the response. Now, if we're talking about reflexes, they could be long or short, right? If it's a long reflexes, it would be something like where you have a change in pH or stretch within your gut tube, like your stomach, and then like using chemoreceptors or mechanoreceptors. And that can either communicate with your central nervous system, like your brain and spinal cord, and that will be a long reflex, or you can use short reflexes. And those don't require the brain or the spinal cord. And so in some regard, your digestive system can kind of just do its own thing. It doesn't need like commands from the brain and spinal cord to mediate digestion. Okay? Now, that's true of some things. You still need your vagus nerves to live and survive to coordinate digestion, but some of the functions of digestion really occur locally with these short reflexes where you actually have receptors in the wall that communicate directly with the enteric nervous system or your gut brain, and then that basically gets the smooth muscle or glands moving to really carry out those reflexes, which actually makes a lot of sense there. So if you guys remember going back to A&P, we also talked about how organs that move a lot inside your body are typically surrounded by a lubricating tissue, right? Do you guys remember what this was called? Like there's a lubricating tissue that surrounds your heart and your lungs. It's a membrane. Do you guys remember what that was? Lubricating membrane around your heart and your lungs. It starts with an S. Are you serous, right? Serous membranes. Yeah, exactly. So the serous membranes, right? They're lubricating membranes. And so we do find a pericardial serous membrane on your heart, and then you do find a pleural serous membrane on your lungs. And there was one more we talked about, and it was the serous membrane around your digestive organs, and we call that peritoneum, if y'all remember, going back to like the first chapter in A&P. So peritoneum was a double layer of serous membrane, okay? And when we have a double layer of peritoneum, we call that mesentery. And the function of mesentery is it anchors your digestive organs in place. So when we saw that picture of all your digestive organs and there's like lots of tubes moving around in different directions, you want to make sure that they're not getting tangled in knots and they're not getting displaced in weird ways. So what happens is that mesentery helps to keep those digestive organs in their proper position. Okay? And so mesentery is made of serous membrane, but it's a double layer of serous membrane. So when serous membranes or peritoneum come together, then they anchor that organ somewhere in the body. Like if it's your mesentery proper, it's holding your small intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. If it's mesocolon, it's holding your large intestine in place. And if you're talking about omentum, it's holding your stomach in place. And all of those three are examples of mesentery, like mesentery proper, mesocolon, and omentum are all examples of mesentery. They can also store fat. So if you guys ever look at like cadaver dissection, you're going to find this mesentery, and it looks like a lot of fatty tissue that's right around the organs, right? And that's because there is fatty tissue in there, but it also has serous membrane which lubricates those organs and prevents frictional damage, right? Okay, so not all of your digestive organs, though, are surrounded by peritoneum. That's kind of the weird thing. So what we find then is a difference here we call retroperitoneal and intraperitoneal. When you guys think of retro, what comes to mind? Like behind, right? Or sort of in the past. So retroperitoneal organs are behind the peritoneum. And what this means is they're not completely surrounded by it. They just are covered by it only on the anterior surface, but they're behind the whole peritoneal sac, which means that they're not completely surrounded, right? And so some examples of retroperitoneal organs would be like your pancreas and your kidneys. These things are actually behind the peritoneum, and it makes sense because those don't move a lot. They don't need to be lubricated. The kidneys are pretty stationary. The pancreas is pretty stationary as well. Now, we also have intraperitoneal, though. And intraperitoneal, so intra means within, right? So intraperitoneal organs are those ones that are completely surrounded by peritoneum. And an example of this would be like your jejunum, your ileum, your spleen, your stomach, your transverse colon. These things are actually surrounded completely by peritoneum. So if we look at a picture of this, what this is showing is like a cross-section of the abdominal wall. You can see some of the vertebra here. And then this is supposed to be showing like the skin surface barrier. And there'll be some muscle in between too, right? And so what we're showing then is in this space would be the abdominal cavity. And what this is showing is something along the alimentary canal or digestive tract. Like this is a part of the tube. And if you guys look closely, this organ is completely surrounded with serous membrane, right? In fact, this layer of serous membrane that's right on the organ is what we call the visceral layer, because remember, viscera means guts, so it's right on the organ. And then this layer out here is called the parietal layer because it's not on the organ. It's kind of lining the inner surface of the body cavity wall, right? And then what type of fluid do you find in between these two, guys? Between the visceral layer and the parietal layer, what type of fluid's there? Serous fluid, exactly, right? So this orange is the serous membrane, but this kind of gray is supposed to represent the serous fluid that's in there. And so the serous fluid is that lubricating fluid. In reality, it wouldn't be this thick, like it wouldn't be almost the entirety of your abdominal wall, or abdominal cavity would be not fluid. But it's just easier to visualize this way, right? And so serous fluid, if you all remember, is mostly water, some electrolytes, and other kind of lubricating glycoproteins. Over here, what we find is actually an example that's more correct because it's more like what your digestive organs would be arranged. And so we have a right side of peritoneum and a left side of peritoneum. And do you guys see where these come together? Like this surrounds the organ on this side and this surrounds the organ on this side. But technically it's two different peritoneal sacs or membranes, right? Where this one there's one, but this one there's a right one and a left one. So what happens, you guys, is that this is still intraperitoneal because it's completely surrounded by visceral peritoneum. However, when these come together, right here, if you guys see this, when these come together, that's what the mesentery is. So when we talked about how mesentery is a double layer of peritoneum, what we're saying is it's the two parietal layers of peritoneum that are coming together, and they form this kind of sheet, right? Now, between these two layers, you find blood vessels, nerves, and fat. And so it'll make sense when we start looking at models or dissections in lab because we're actually going to see this sort of fatty mesentery, which is actually made of the double layer of peritoneum that helps anchor your organs in place. Okay? So have you guys ever heard of like intraperitoneal injections, like our IP injections? And so you might get these like if you need to get a drug that's sort of more slowly absorbed by your body, or sometimes there's certain vaccines that you need to inject there as well. So if y'all heard of like, with rabies, if you get like the rabies vaccine or the treatment after getting bit by a potentially rabid animal, they inject with that drug into the peritoneal cavity. And so we call that an intraperitoneal injection. But to get to that cavity, what you need to do then is take that needle, it would need to go through the abdominal skin, through the abdominal muscle, through the parietal layer of peritoneum here, and you're trying to inject into this fluid space, which is the peritoneal cavity, which is full of serous fluid. That sounds super painful, and I hope I never get bit by a rabid animal. So, okay, one of the final kind of topics we'll talk about in this introductory section is blood supply to and from your digestive organs. Now, to your digestive organs, most of these digestive organs are actually served by what's called the abdominal aorta. So the aorta comes from your heart, but as it curves down towards your abdominal cavity, there's all these branches that come off of it. Like you have the celiac trunk, you have the superior mesenteric and the inferior mesenteric arteries, and they supply blood to your digestive organs, like your liver, your spleen, your stomach, your small intestine, and your large intestine, right? So those organs get arterial supply from the aorta. Now, when the blood flows through those organs and it starts to come back through veins, what happens then, you guys, is that all of the veins from your digestive organs converge into what we call hepatic portal circulation. So hepatic means liver, right? Portal means transport, and circulation because it's blood flow. So what happens, you guys, is that nutrient-rich, oxygen-poor venous blood from your digestive organs is sent straight to the liver for processing. However, and I'll ask you guys this. This is blood, right? So what nutrients would not be sent straight to the liver for processing? Fats, because lipids, remember? So where are lipids absorbed into? Lymphatic system, you got it. And so that would not be part of this hepatic portal circulation. That's a different process. But if you're talking about carbohydrates or protein or nucleic acids or minerals or even toxins you might absorb along your digestive tract, you know, those actually are absorbed in your bloodstream and they go to your liver through this hepatic portal circulation for processing. So if we can visualize what this hepatic portal circulation looks like, effectively it's a lot of veins that come from areas like your small intestine, your large intestine, and the distal part of your large intestine, your spleen, your stomach, your esophagus, and all of these veins converge. They come together and form a gigantic vein right here called the hepatic portal vein. And so what happens then is the liver is the organ that receives this nutrient-rich blood first. And you might wonder, well, why does the liver receive this nutrient-rich blood first? Well, the liver can process those nutrients, right? It can like interconvert nutrient types. It can store those nutrients in the liver for later use. It can also package some of those nutrients for further processing. And it can even kind of detoxify that blood. Like let's say if you did absorb some drugs or toxins, they actually get sent straight to the liver, and their liver can detoxify those or break those down before they end up in the rest of your bloodstream and go to the rest of your organs. So in this regard, you guys, like the liver is kind of like the gatekeeper of your venous blood from your digestive organs, right? It makes sure that everything's processed and clear before it goes out to the rest of your body. So that actually makes a lot of sense. Now, what do you guys think would happen, though, if the liver were failing? Like if you had liver failure, what would happen to this blood flow? Would you have as much blood flow going through the liver if it's damaged? No. So where's all this venous blood going to back up into if you had liver failure? Into those organs. You got it. In fact, one of the signs of liver failure is something called ascites, which looks like a pot belly. And what's going on there is the venous blood's backing up into your abdominal organs. And that leads to some swelling, which is from fluid leakage. And so then they get this kind of large pot belly. But it's not because of fat, it's because of water. And they're having excess water building up in their abdominal cavity because there's too much blood pressure in these portal veins. And so it's kind of interesting. So that's something we call the ascites, and we'll come back to that in a future chapter too. So let's look at the layers of the alimentary canal. So if you guys remember, the alimentary canal, it's the tube, muscular tube, from mouth to anus, right? Now, if we look at these layers, we have things like your mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. The mucosa is the layer or tunic, so tunic means layer. It's the layer or tunic that surrounds the lumen of the organ. So if you guys know, lumen means space, right? So the mucosa would surround that space or lumen. Then deep to that, you'd find what's called the submucosa, and that's going to be a connective tissue layer with like blood vessels and nerves, and it supports that mucosa. Then you have another layer called the muscularis externa that has smooth muscle, usually 2 layers of smooth muscle. Usually have a circular and a longitudinal layer. And then we have a serosa, right? So serosa is the serous membrane that surrounds the outside of that digestive organ. However, do all digestive organs have a serous membrane around the entire thing? No, exactly. So one thing that's important to note, you guys, is that if it's a digestive organ that's like retroperitoneal or not surrounded by serous membrane, we don't call it a serosa on the very outside of that organ. Instead, it's called an adventitia, which is like a thicker layer of fibrous protective tissue. So that would be adventitia instead of serosa. All right, so inside of this gut tube, we have enteric neurons, which are part of your gut brain we talked about. And this gut brain has 100 million neurons in there. It sounds like a lot, but it's not nearly as much as what's in your real brain, which would be 100 billion, right? And the submucosal nerve plexus works in conjunction with the myenteric nerve plexus to coordinate the short reflexes for your digestive tract, but it also receives signals from your brain and spinal cord to coordinate the long reflexes as well. And so these types of neurons, you guys, they actually release serotonin as their neurotransmitter. So what's kind of interesting then is that there's some hypotheses then between your gut function and your sort of sense of well-being and happiness, because they both use serotonin. Like that, the parts of your brain that are involved with mediating the sense of well-being and happiness, those use serotonin, and so do your gut neurons that also use serotonin. So it's kind of interesting. So if we look at this gut tube here, you guys, this is the lumen, right? And the lumen is essentially the space, and then we have a mucosa that surrounds that lumen. So all of this is the mucosa. And so in the mucosa, we find an epithelium. This type of epithelium that lines the inside of the alimentary canal, it's usually simple columnar epithelium because it's thin enough to absorb but still fairly thick and therefore it's able to be protective, right? So you have a simple columnar epithelium that lines most of your digestive tract. Now, deep to that, we have a little bit of connective tissue, which we call lamina propria. And if you guys remember, lamina propria is actually loose areolar connective tissue. And so this loose areolar connective tissue has a lot of ground substance that can nourish the avascular epithelium here. And then deep to that, we have another layer of muscle called the muscularis mucosa. It's just a really, really thin layer of smooth muscle that's involved with some muscle contraction and propulsion of digestive contents. So these three together form the mucosal layer, right? Now deep to the muscularis mucosa, this thicker layer of white tissue, you guys, that's the submucosa. Submucosa is usually made of a dense, irregular connective tissue. So if you guys remember going back to A&P, we said that dense, irregular connective tissue was called that because it's densely packed with collagen fibers that go in lots of different directions, right? So the collagen fibers don't all line up the same way. They actually go in lots of different angles, and that makes sense to be in your digestive organ because then you can help resist stress in many directions as these digestive organs move a lot, right? Now, what's also embedded within the submucosa are some larger glands, like these could be some mucus glands that can, effectively drain mucus into the inside of the lumen. What do you guys think is the function of this mucus? Like, why do you want mucus along the inside of the digestive tract? So it's lubrication. Good. What else? Do you guys know? It's also protective. So the mucus layer inside of your digestive tract wall, right, like surrounding the lumen, that also serves as a nice protective layer, and it protects against the digestive enzymes that you're releasing. Because guess what those digestive enzymes break down? Well, they break down proteins, they break down lipids, nucleic acids, right? What are your cells made of? Proteins, lipids, nucleic acids. So this is kind of the weird thing about the digestive tract, is you're releasing enzymes that could potentially digest your own tissues. So what you need then is a nice protective layer to separate those two, and mucus does that. This is especially true in your stomach. So inside your stomach, what you find is it's a super acidic fluid, right? A pH of 1. That would effectively burn a hole through your stomach wall, or the wall of your stomach, if you didn't have a protective layer of mucus. So the mucus layer inside your stomach actually prevents your own stomach acid from eating through the stomach wall. What? That's crazy, right? So you need this protective mucus. Now, what you also find in the submucosa, you guys, are a lot of the larger blood vessels and veins, right? I'm sorry, like arteries and veins, right? And so these would help nourish the surrounding tissue. We have some lymphatics nearby as well. And then if we go a little deeper, this right here is the muscularis externa. So the muscularis externa are two layers of smooth muscle. So you have a smooth muscle layer here and a smooth muscle layer here. This one's the circular layer, and this one's a longitudinal layer. And together, they can make a wave of muscle contraction, right? Because you have one that squeezes and one that kind of propels forward. So you have squeezing and propelling. And together, they make a wave that can move along the length of that digestive tube. And I'll show you guys a video of that here in a little bit. Now, if you guys look closely, these little yellow fibers would be your myenteric and submucosal nerve plexuses. So now you can see what the gut brain looks like. The gut brain itself, it's not really like a little kind of aggregation of neurons. It's mostly like a distributed network of neurons all along the length of your alimentary canal. And then what's this lubricating tissue that surrounds the outside of the organ right here, you guys? That's mesentery, which is made of peritoneum, which is a type of membrane called serous membrane. Good. And do you guys see when this tissue comes together, it forms this double layer, mesentery? And so this is one serous membrane here. That's the parietal layer of serous membrane. Here's another parietal layer of serous membrane. And then locked in between, we got blood vessels, nerve fibers, lymphatics. But what would also fill this space here, you guys? You guys remember? Fat. Yeah. So there'd also be a lot of fat that would fill this space too. And that's usually, I can identify it, is that it's usually really packed full of fat. So once you start looking at models and dissections and you pull apart like the small intestine, you're going to see a lot of this kind of yellowish, whitish tissue. That's going to be the fat that's locked in the mesentery. And so I'll point that out to you guys when we see it.